There are stories whispered in the dark corners of villages, not loud enough to be remembered, but never quiet enough to forget. In the heart of Asia, among scorched temples and silent rice fields, spirits linger not in anger, but in waiting, waiting for what was never finished, waiting for what was never burned. This is not a tale of demons clawing through mirrors, nor curses shouted into the night. This is older, quieter, deeper. It is the kind of horror that settles in the bones of tradition, where rituals, once broken, leave more than just silence behind. Tonight, we return to northern Thailand, to a temple with no monks, a home with no blessings, and an offering that should never have been opened. Light your incense, leave the jasmine by the door, and whatever you do, don't break the circle. The road to Baan Nong Luang was narrower than Aree remembered, a thin vein of crumbling asphalt threading between fields of rice, their emerald blades swaying like whispers in the late monsoon wind. The further she drove, the less her phone could hold a signal, and the more the landscape seemed to swallow time. It had been over a decade since she last saw this place, her grandmother's village, quiet, reluctant, untouched by anything modern except rusted electricity poles and the occasional solar light tacked to a fence post. Bangkok felt 1,000 years away. The taxi driver had stopped at the edge of the village, muttering something about bad luck and too many trees. He refused to go further. So Aree walked the last quarter-kilometer, her suitcase rattling over packed dirt and the low hum of insects growing louder with each step. No one greeted her, but she could feel them watching from behind faded curtains, from bamboo porches, from inside homes that smelled of betel nut and old oil lamps. Her grandmother's house was still standing, barely. The wooden stilts that held it above the soft earth had begun to sink on one side, making the structure lean like a tired man. Vines curled up its sides, clutching the rotting slats. The spirit house near the steps was broken at the corner, and the incense bowl sat empty, as if no one had offered anything in years. Aree exhaled. "This won't take long," she whispered to herself. The lawyer in Chiang Mai had made it clear the property was hers now. Sell it, clean it out, or burn it down. The deed was signed, and with no other family left, the responsibility fell on her. Just a few days, she had thought, long enough to sort through heirlooms and memories, and maybe understand why her grandmother had never come back to the city. Inside, the air was musty with time and neglect. Dust clung to every surface like a thin veil. The windows were streaked with dried rain, and the scent of old herbs lingered in the corners. On a table near the window sat her grandmother's prayer beads, brittle and yellowed. Next to them, a bowl of dried jasmine flowers that must have been placed long after anyone had lived here, and yet, somehow, they still held their fragrance. She slept fitfully that night on the same mat where she once curled beside her grandmother as a child. But the silence wasn't the same. It pressed in too close, too still, the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty, it felt full. She found the urn the next morning. Tucked away in the wooden wardrobe at the back of the house, it sat behind old clothes folded in banana leaf bundles, a rusted rice sickle, and a bundle of red candles that had never been lit. The urn was bronze, sealed tight, and bound with a red string that had been wrapped in 13 knots. Beneath it, someone had laid a small rectangle of banana leaf, dried and blackened at the edges as though it had once touched fire, but never fully burned. Attached to the string was a fragile slip of parchment. The words were handwritten in her grandmother's sharp, practiced hand. "Do not open. Burn only at the old temple. Do not forget the jasmine." Aree frowned. She turned the urn in her hands. It was heavy, but not metallic in a normal way. Heavier, as if something within carried weight not of this world. She set it aside. By midday, she had unpacked half the house and found herself breathing in dust more than air. On a whim, she returned to the urn and examined the string again. The knots were tight, but old. It wouldn't take much to remove them. She didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. Yes, her grandmother had raised her on bedtime stories of hungry spirits and death curses, of shadow women who walked backwards, and ghosts that smelled of sweet rot. But those were just stories, cultural metaphors. She was an adult. She paid taxes. She had voted. She had a degree. So she told herself. And so she undid the knots. One by one, as the last thread slipped loose, the lid seemed to shudder under her touch. And then she opened it. The scent hit her instantly, like overripe fruit fermenting in the sun, layered with a strange sweetness. Jasmine, but not fresh. Jasmine steeped in time, in something darker. There was ash inside, and something else beneath it. A cloth bundle, half-burned, wrapped in rice paper. Then the wind blew through the open slats of the house. Only there was no wind outside. The windows were closed. The curtain lifted on its own, and every candle in the room flickered, though none were lit. The paper lantern above her head swayed, creaking as if caught in a breeze that wasn't there. And the bronze urn in her hands began to vibrate, just slightly. Aree gasped and slammed the lid shut. That night, the first dream came. She stood in the center of the house, though it no longer looked like home. The wood was scorched black, the window shattered. Rain poured through a hole in the roof that didn't exist during the day. Her grandmother was kneeling in the center of a salt circle, weeping silently. Around her stood 12 women, draped in funeral white, their feet bare, hair soaked. They chanted, not words, but long vowel sounds that twisted through the dream like smoke. One woman turned to face Aree directly. Her eyes were missing. Aree screamed awake, sweat-drenched and gasping. But the worst part was not the dream. It was what she found when she stepped on the wooden floor with trembling feet. Wet prints, trailing from the front door to the foot of her bed, and the scent of jasmine thick in the air. She looked down at her own hands and saw ashes clinging to her fingertips. The jasmine smell lingered through morning, not fresh like a market stall, not even the dusty kind you find strung on old amulets. This was wet, rotted, the kind of jasmine that grows from graves, not gardens. Aree paced the room, trying to ignore the fading footprints on the wood. She pressed her palm to the floor, expecting dampness, but it was dry, bone dry. The only moisture was on her skin, slick with cold sweat that hadn't yet left her since waking. She scrubbed her hands twice. The ash wouldn't come off. No matter how hard she washed, a gray film clung to her cuticles, as if it had worked itself into her skin. Her mouth was dry, bitter, but when she spat into the sink, the water ran gray, like soot had pooled behind her teeth. She didn't eat that morning, couldn't. The kitchen felt wrong, like something was breathing beneath the floorboards, waiting for her to be still. She stared at the urn again. It sat quietly on the table now, its bronze surface dull, but no longer trembling. The red string she had untied lay beside it, like a worm drying in the sun. Aree thought about calling someone, a friend, a neighbor, a monk, but her phone had no signal again. She held it up to the window, then the door. Nothing. She turned on her data, then off again. Still nothing. She looked back at the urn, then at the note her grandmother had left. Do not open. Burn only at the old temple. Do not forget the jasmine. What temple? She wandered the village that afternoon. Most houses looked abandoned, or perhaps simply unwelcoming. Doors cracked open only slightly. Children watched her behind railings, their eyes wide, their mouths unmoving. She asked 3 people for directions. Only one responded. An old woman with clouded eyes and a mouthful of beetle stain pointed toward the horizon with a twisted finger and whispered, "Wat Mai Ban Pi, the one with no monks." That was all she said. She would say nothing else. Aree followed the direction given, past the rice fields, through a break in the trees where the path turned to clay and gravel. Crows gathered in unnatural silence above, not cawing, just watching, like sentinels, like judges. After 20 minutes of walking, she saw it, or what was left of it. The temple was half collapsed, its wooden roof scorched as if from fire decades old. The central prayer hall leaned at an angle. The statue of the Buddha had no head. And yet the spirit house, a small ornate shrine to the side, stood untouched, bright red with white jasmine garlands bleached to bone by the sun. There were no incense sticks, no footprints, no signs of life, only stillness, and something watching her. She stepped inside the remains of the hall. Termite-eaten beams groaned softly under her weight. The scent of old wood and ancient offerings thickened the air. On the floor in front of the altar, she saw faint circles of salt, discolored but still visible, like ghostly echoes of some forgotten rite. And in the center of the circle, scorch marks, just the shape of fire, no ashes, no residue, as if something had burned, without flame. She bent down and touched the mark. It was cold. The moment she returned to the house, the dreams came back, more vivid, more precise. She is standing in the forest now, barefoot and shivering. Rain pours, but it doesn't soak her. It moves around her, falling upward like time has reversed. Ahead, the scorched temple glows with lantern light. It is no longer ruined. It is whole, golden, alive with chanting. She walks toward it. Inside, she sees her grandmother again, younger now, in her 30s maybe, her face unlined, her eyes alert. She is kneeling beside the urn, and around her stand the 12 women, all in white, all soaked, all barefoot. They chant. A monk stands behind them, hands raised in invocation. But something goes wrong. A breeze cuts through the temple, unnatural, biting, cold with death. The salt circle scatters. Jasmine petals blow away. The women scream. The monk vanishes in a blink of red smoke. And from the urn, a hand reaches out. Aree woke screaming, her tongue thick with ash again, her lips cracked, her throat dry, her ears filled with the faint sound of chanting that did not stop even when she covered them. She stumbled to the mirror to make sure she was still herself. Her reflection stared back, then blinked after she did. A full second later, she backed away, heart pounding. The mirror did it again, lagging behind, then smiling. She wasn't smiling. She fled from the room, ran out into the yard, breath heavy, sob thick in her throat. But there on the porch steps she saw them. Footprints, wet, human, but backwards. They started at her front door and walked toward the rice fields, as if something had entered, not left. She couldn't sleep the rest of the night. The urn sat in the center of the room, like it had moved itself. She hadn't put it there. She was sure of it. By sunrise, something inside her had shifted. This wasn't grief. It wasn't imagination. This was something older than either. The curse had not begun with her, but somehow, in breaking that red string, she had invited it to finish. And now it would not stop. Not until the jasmine burned. In Thai belief, the spirit house is a home within a home, a place for guardian spirits to dwell. But what happens when the house they watch over is not the one you live in, but the one you broke? Aree stood barefoot on the front steps of her grandmother's house, arms folded, breath misting slightly in the morning air. It wasn't cold, but her body shivered all the same, as if something inside her had dropped several degrees since the urn was opened. The spirit house, perched just beyond the steps, drew her eyes again. She had walked past it 100 times as a child, never touching, never questioning. It had always been there, red-painted wood with gold trim, mounted on a pole just above her head. Tiny ceramic guardians sat frozen at the doorway. Once there had been incense bowls and flower offerings inside. Now only dust and the faintest trace of ash. She could have sworn it had been facing the road yesterday. Now it was angled toward her room. Aree approached it slowly. The wooden beams of the little shrine were cracked but intact. At its base, dried leaves and jasmine petals lay scattered, fresh ones. They hadn't been there yesterday. A bird skull had been left in front of the offering bowl, deliberately, as if placed. She looked around. The yard was still. No wind, no footprints. Just the feeling, thick and suffocating, that she was being watched. Not from behind, but from above. That afternoon, Aree went back inside and covered all the mirrors in the house, all but one. She left the bathroom mirror uncovered, not out of courage, but defiance. A test. If the reflection moved again, she wanted to see it with her own eyes, not from the corner of her vision. She spent most of the day flipping through her grandmother's old notebooks, searching for anything, clues, spells, prayers, names. But her writing had always been cryptic, even in life. Pages full of astrological diagrams, chants in Pali, stories of spirits and failed exorcisms, ritual notes scrawled in code. Then she found a drawing, a sketch of a bronze urn, with 13 red knots, and a single word written beneath in thick charcoal: bind or burn. That night, she heard chanting again, but this time it wasn't in her dreams. It came from outside the house. She rose, breath shallow, and crept to the window. There were no people in the yard, no lights, nothing. But she could hear it. Voices, soft and distant, echoing across the rice fields. Female voices chanting in rhythm, not in language, repeating, layered, 12, maybe 13. And then a sudden crack. She turned. The spirit house had split, right down the middle, as if something had forced its way out. The next morning, Aree knocked on a neighbor's door. An old man answered. His face sagged with years, his skin leathery, but his eyes were alert. She asked about the spirit house. He stared at her in silence, then finally muttered, "You opened it." Aree's throat tightened. What? He looked past her, toward her house. His hands trembled as he folded them. "That urn should have burned. Your grandmother failed. You failed more. Now she is watching." "Who is?" Aree asked. He didn't answer, but he whispered a word. "Hong." Aree returned to her home shaken. She had grown up hearing whispers about Phi Tai Hong, violent spirits of those who died suddenly, tragically, or with rage clinging to their soul. Most feared of all were women who died pregnant. Their spirits never settled. They wanted revenge, or worse, replacement. She checked the spirit house again. It was still split, but now there were footprints in the dirt below. Not muddy, not dusty, just the impression of presence, like something had stood there watching. That evening her phone buzzed for the first time in days. 1 bar of signal. She dialed a monk she had met in Chiang Mai during a temple donation drive last year. He had spoken kindly, calmly. He might know what to do. The call connected, briefly. "Aree?" he answered. His voice was strained, faint. "I opened something, an urn, from my grandmother's house. Now there's something here. The spirit house cracked. I'm seeing—" "Did you burn jasmine?" he interrupted. "What? Did you burn jasmine when you opened it?" The line cut out. Just a soft, static hum. Then one sentence came through, warbled and broken. "If you do not finish the offering, it will finish with you." That night, she lit incense. She placed a jasmine garland on the spirit house, though it was broken. She whispered an apology in Thai, then English, then Thai again. And for the first time since arriving, the house fell silent. No voices, no dreams, only stillness. Until 3:07 a.m., when she awoke to the sound of breathing. It wasn't hers. It came from under her bed. She dared not look, but the mirror in the bathroom, the only one she had left uncovered, reflected a figure standing behind her door. A woman, dressed in white, wet, barefoot, and smiling with black gums. Aree turned on all the lights in the house. She checked every lock, but the mirror had changed. The woman was no longer there, only Aree. But behind her, the spirit house had appeared, inside the mirror. Wherever she moved, it remained, as though a new window had opened into something that should never be reflected. And in that mirror spirit house, the urn was open again. The red string lay beside it, burned to ash. There are places where time does not pass, only waits. And some temples do not forget the rituals you abandon. They remember, in ash, in silence, in the eyes that still watch from headless statues. Aree returned to the temple the next morning. She packed the urn in a cotton bag, wrapped in banana leaves, as her grandmother had originally done. Her hands trembled, but her face was calm. A strange numbness had settled over her, not peace, not resolve, but a kind of quiet fatalism. The chanting hadn't stopped in her dreams, nor had the woman in white. She had begun to feel it even in the daylight now, that creeping presence just behind her spine, like someone brushing a finger down the back of her neck. The urn was growing heavier, as if whatever lived inside it now knew she was bringing it home. The forest trail to the temple had changed, somehow longer, thicker, The trees leaned closer, branches curling like fingers above her head. Even the birds were silent. When she reached the temple clearing, the sun disappeared behind a sudden veil of clouds. The building stood as it had before, leaning, burned, broken. But now the Buddha statue was gone completely, not just headless, missing. The platform where it once sat had been scraped bare, as if something had dragged it into the forest and buried it. Aree stepped closer. The spirit house beside the temple looked untouched again, newly cleaned, jasmine petals scattered neatly at its base. But no one had been here. At least, no one alive. Inside the main hall, the air was thick with mildew and incense that had never been burned. The lingering scent of rituals promised, but not fulfilled. Aree laid the urn at the center of the room. The circle of salt from before was almost gone, faded to a whisper. She pulled out new salt and began pouring carefully, around the urn, around herself, just like in her dream. She didn't know the chant, she didn't know the steps, but something inside her, some blood memory, some echo of her grandmother guided her. Her mouth moved, words came, not Thai, not any language she recognized, but they felt true. As she finished the circle, the air shifted. Warmth drained from the room. The colors around her dimmed. Shadows grew longer, crawling like spilled ink across the broken floor. And then from the rafters above, a jasmine blossom fell. Fresh, wet. It landed beside the urn. Aree froze, then slowly looked up. There was no ceiling above her anymore, just sky, open, cloudless, dead still. And standing at the edge of the circle now, just beyond the salt line, was the woman in white. She looked younger now. Her face was visible, soft, almost beautiful. But her belly was round, bruised, swollen with death. Her feet were bare and bleeding. Her lips whispered something Aree couldn't hear, couldn't understand, but it scraped inside her skull like glass on bone. Aree began to chant again. The spirit smiled. The lights flickered. There were no lights. The wind rose suddenly, from inside the temple, not outside. It howled through the room, swirling the salt, testing the barrier. The jasmine petals lifted, spun, and fell again. And Aree realized something. There was no flame. She had no fire, no match, no way to burn the offering. The ritual couldn't be completed without it. Her grandmother's note had been clear. Burn only at the old temple. Do not forget the jasmine. She had brought the jasmine. She had forgotten the fire. And the spirit knew it. Its smile widened. The walls began to groan. From every corner of the room, whispers poured in, not words, but the sound of drowning, of lungs filling, of mouths gasping for prayers never finished. Aree grabbed the urn and backed away from the altar, tripping over the scattered salt line. The spirit stepped forward, and the circle broke. The wind died instantly. The world went silent. The woman in white stood directly in front of her now, close enough to touch. Her eyes were bottomless, black, not void, but full of something ancient and wet and screaming. She reached out a hand, not to grab Aree, but to point toward the woods, toward the path behind the temple. And in a voice that sounded both like her grandmother's and her own, layered together like overlapping film reels, she whispered, "Where he burned and ran." Aree blinked, and she was alone again. The air returned. The temple dimmed. The woman was gone. But the urn lid had slid open again, on its own. And inside was no longer just ash. There was a piece of cloth, singed, still warm. She pulled it out. It was part of a monk's robe, and inside it, folded tight, was a black and white photograph. 13 women, all in funeral white, and one man in robes, standing behind them, hands raised in blessing. Her grandmother was among the women, and so was the woman in white. But the monk, his face had been scratched out deeply, as if with a knife, and beneath the photo, written in her grandmother's handwriting, "He ran before it was done. He took the fire with him. He will not speak, but he remembers. Find him before it chooses you." Aree felt something shift beneath the floorboards, a low creak, like a breath. She didn't wait to find out more. She grabbed the urn, the salt, and the cloth and ran out of the temple. Behind her, the spirit house turned to face her as she passed. Not just the trick of the angle, it moved, deliberately. The trail home felt longer this time. The forest pressed closer, and at one point, Aree thought she heard footsteps behind her, echoing her own. Not chasing, just mirroring, matching, waiting. When she reached the edge of the village, she turned back one last time. There was nothing there, just trees. And yet, the scent of jasmine and smoke drifted on the breeze. Some rituals are not meant to protect. Some are meant to trap. And sometimes the salt isn't to keep spirits out, but to keep guilt in. The village midwife lived at the edge of Ban Nong Luang, where the rice paddies ended and the forest began. Her name was Wai Khwan, and Aree remembered her vaguely, a quiet woman with a crooked back and incense always hanging from her earlobes. She had delivered half the children in the village, including Aree herself. But no one saw her anymore. They said she had stopped speaking after the fire. Aree stood at her front gate, clutching the photograph she found in the urn, the one with the 13 women and the faceless monk. Wai Khwan was in it too, younger, thinner, but unmistakable. The gate creaked open before Aree knocked. Inside, the house was dark, the air thick with the scent of camphor, oil, and dried jasmine. Wai Khwan sat on a mat in the center of the room, legs folded, hands on her knees. Her eyes were milky, clouded with age, but they locked on Aree the moment she stepped inside. Aree didn't speak right away. She kneeled slowly, laid the photograph on the floor between them, and whispered, "You were there, weren't you?" Silence, then a soft nod. Aree placed the monk's cloth scrap on the mat next. Wai Khwan reached out with trembling fingers and touched it. Her hand recoiled. She hissed, not from pain, but from recognition. Her lips parted, her mouth quivered, and then she spoke for the first time in years. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The story came slowly. Aree sat and listened as Wai Khwan unraveled the truth her grandmother had hidden for decades. It began with a Wai Khwan ritual, an ancient blessing ceremony, but this one had been twisted, corrupted. There had been a death, a young pregnant woman, Nang Tida, Wai Khwan called her, found hanging in the forest. Everyone whispered suicide,
but those who saw her body knew better. Her wrists were bruised, her stomach torn. No one claimed responsibility, but her spirit returned, not in grief, in fury. She screamed through the bamboo at night. She left blood on windowsills, ash in cradles, bruises on newborns. The villagers begged the monks to intervene, but the abbot refused. Phi Tai Hong cannot be banished, only bargained with. So they did not call the temple. They made their own ritual. 13 women, 1 urn, a salt circle, jasmine petals, and a chant passed down from the shadows of the old forest. It was meant to trap, not free, to contain the spirit in a vessel, not to offer peace, but to bind her rage for generations. The monk in the photo, Pra Ajanvira, had agreed to help, but when the moment came, he panicked. He saw what they were summoning, what they had promised to contain. He fled the temple, taking the ceremonial fire with him, the final element needed to finish the binding. Without fire, the jasmine could not burn, and without burned jasmine, she was never sealed, just chained, angry, waiting. Aree felt her stomach turn. So my grandmother, she was part of it. Wai Khwan nodded. She led it. The leader must place the urn, must seal it with red thread, must instruct the next generation should the binding ever be broken. Aree swallowed hard. And now I've unsealed her? Wai Khwan didn't answer. She didn't have to. Aree pulled the photograph closer. Her finger rested on the monk whose face had been violently scratched out. He ran, but I found this cloth. It's part of his robe. Wai Khwan nodded. Her hands trembled. He lives, but not like before. He's in Long Khun Hospital, the old care center in the hills. No one speaks to him. He just rocks and whispers. Whispers what? Wai Khwan looked directly at Aree for the first time in the conversation. The final words of the chant. That night, Aree lit jasmine and placed it on the spirit house. The broken shrine still stood at an angle, but the flowers stayed fresh for longer this time. The air around it stilled. She tried to sleep, but when her eyes closed, she was not taken to dreams. She was taken back. She stood again in the circle of salt, but this time she was inside it. The other women surrounded her, white robes soaked and dripping. Her grandmother stood opposite her, eyes blank. Wai Khwan next to her, chanting in a voice made of gravel and grief. And then, from the shadows outside the circle, the spirit crawled forward. Not walked, crawled, on elbows and knees, dragging her swollen belly behind her like a sack of drowned stones. Blood smeared the salt as she reached the edge, but the circle held until someone moved. A man in monk's robes. He stepped over the salt. He stepped toward the spirit, and as he reached out to stop her, he vanished into smoke. Aree screamed awake. The scent of burning jasmine filled the room, but there was no incense, only ash on her pillow and wet handprints across her blanket, as if someone had kneeled above her while she slept. In the hallway, the mirror had cracked again. Her reflection still smiled slower than she did, but now it bled from the eyes, not red, but black, like the water of a drowned well. She packed that morning, clothes, the urn, the photograph, the cloth, and salt. She would go to Long Khun Hospital. She would find the monk. She would finish what they started. Because if she didn't, something else would finish her. As she left the house, she looked one last time at the spirit house. It had turned again, now facing the forest, facing the temple. And for just a second, Aree saw a figure in white standing at the tree line, watching, not moving, but swaying slightly, like a corpse hanging from a rope. Mirrors are not meant to reflect the soul, only the skin. But when something watches from the other side, not your face, not your body, just a whisper of you, you'll know, because it won't blink with you. It will wait, and then smile. Long Khun Hospital was more asylum than clinic, a crumbling 3-story shell on the edge of the northern hills, hidden behind overgrown hedges and bamboo that had split the pavement with their roots. Once a monastery turned sanctuary, it now served as a home for those forgotten by both family and temple. The sky darkened as Aree arrived. Clouds gathered low, pressing down like something was trying to smother the world. She clutched the urn tight beneath her jacket, her breath fogged in the cool air. There was no incense at the door, no monks in robes, just a nurse with gray eyes who barely looked up as she signed the visitor log. "Pra Ajahn Weera?" Aree asked. The nurse pointed to the far end of the corridor. "Third floor, last room. He doesn't speak, not to anyone." The hallway lights flickered as she walked. Each door she passed bore a name written in fading red ink, but some names had been scratched out violently with deep gouges as if from nails, not pens. From inside the rooms, murmurs echoed, prayers mostly, and laughter that didn't sound joyful. Aree didn't look through the windows. She had learned by now, some things only become real when seen. Room 309. The last door. It creaked open before she touched it. Inside, the walls were bare except for one thing: a mirror. Large, cracked, hung directly across from the narrow hospital bed. And in that bed sat a man in faded orange robes, his eyes wide and unblinking. He rocked gently, mouth moving without sound, as if reciting something to himself. "Ajahn Weera?" Aree asked softly. No response. She stepped closer. He flinched when the floor creaked, but didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the mirror, still rocking, still mouthing words. She sat beside him and pulled out the cloth from the urn, the fragment of his old robe. "You left them," she said quietly. "They summoned something they couldn't finish, and you ran." The monk's rocking stopped, but his eyes never moved, still on the mirror, still unblinking. Aree glanced at it. Her own reflection stared back, but moved just a second too slow. Aree blinked. The reflection blinked late, then tilted its head when she hadn't. Her heart raced. She looked back at the monk. He had begun to whisper now, soft, barely audible. Aree leaned in and heard the words, "Mirror backward, ash inside, salt around, jasmine must die. The chant. He was reciting the final verse of the ritual, the one her grandmother never completed. Aree repeated it softly with him. Mirror backward, ash inside, salt around, jasmine must die. His eyes darted to her for the first time, then to the urn in her lap. He reached out with trembling fingers and pointed to the mirror. "Don't trust it," he said. "That's where she waits." Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror smiled, not Aree's face, not her lips, but the thing watching her, using her skin like a mask. And behind it, in the mirror's depth, stood a woman in white, barefoot, soaked, her belly bloated and veined like a drowned corpse. She stood behind the reflection, but no one stood behind Aree. She turned anyway, but nothing. But when she looked back, the mirror showed the woman now whispering into her reflection's ear, and the reflection nodded. Aree stumbled backward. The monk screamed suddenly, a hoarse, gurgling cry that rose and then snapped off like a thread being cut. Blood ran from his nose, from his ears. He convulsed once and went still. His eyes still locked on the mirror, frozen, open. Aree ran, out of the room, down the hallway, through the flickering lights, past patients murmuring forgotten prayers, past doors with scratched-out names. When she reached the exit, her reflection in the glass door was already waiting. And this time, it didn't smile. It opened its mouth and whispered, "Burn me, or take my place." That night, she couldn't sleep. Back at her grandmother's house, she covered every mirror, even the windows, anything that could reflect her face. She sat in the corner of the room with a circle of salt around her, the urn in front of her, jasmine on her lap. The scent was stronger now, not sweet, sickly, like flowers left on a grave too long. She rocked just like the monk had, repeating the chant, mirror backward, ash inside, salt around, jasmine must die. Her voice cracked, her lips bled, but she didn't stop, because now the reflection was not only in mirrors. It was in the puddle outside, the glass of water, the lens of her phone, turned off but still catching the faintest shimmer of movement. Her reflection had spread. It was no longer bound to glass. At 3:07 a.m., the hour of her dreams, she blinked and didn't see anything blink back. She was alone now, not even herself.
They dress her in white so she will not be mistaken for the living. But she never rests, not when the ritual is broken, not when the jasmine still rots unburned. She waits barefoot, wet, at the door of whoever opened her cage. It began with the water. At first, it was a single puddle in front of Aree's bedroom door, a thin circle of moisture, even though it hadn't rained for days. She wiped it up, thought nothing of it. But by morning, the puddle had returned, larger, and it trailed all the way to the base of her bed. The air smelled like stagnant river water, sweet, decaying, like jasmine steeped too long in a bowl that was never emptied. She opened the urn again. The ashes hadn't changed, but something had been added. A single strand of long black hair, coiled at the bottom like a question left unanswered. Aree touched it with the tip of her finger. It was still damp. That night she didn't sleep. She couldn't, because something was knocking. Not on the door, on the walls. Softly at first, then faster, then everywhere. Like wet hands slapping from inside the wood. Like a child trying to claw her way out of a coffin. Aree lit every candle she had. She poured another salt circle and recited the chant again. But the jasmine petals she'd placed around the urn were already black, rotting, as if time passed differently for them. And then from the window, she heard footsteps. Squish, drag, squish, drag. They stopped right outside. She didn't look, but the window pane began to fog from breath on the other side. 3:07 a.m. The mirror in the hallway shattered. A single shard remained hanging, shaped like a tooth. In its fractured surface, Aree saw her reflection, but behind her was a woman. She wore white funeral robes. Her hair was soaked, hanging over her face like seaweed. Her skin was pale and slightly green, bloated. Her stomach was round, bruised, as if filled with water and grief. She stood motionless, except for her head, which twitched just slightly to the side, as if listening, as if deciding. Aree turned around. The hallway was empty, but the floor was wet, and on the wall, smeared in dark, oily streaks, were words. She burned, you opened, burn her or burn with her. By dawn, the wet footprints had reached the kitchen. Aree followed them, heart hammering. They led to the sink, and inside the sink was a white cloth bundle. She unwrapped it slowly, hands shaking. Inside was a fetus doll, hand-carved from teak, with black thread stitched across its eyes and mouth. She dropped it. It hit the floor with a thud, and then rolled perfectly toward the urn. The voice came again that night, whispered through the cracks in the walls, beneath the floorboards, behind the light fixtures. A woman's voice, not angry, not screaming, just sad, so deeply sad that it curdled in the stomach. She said, "She left me. They all left me. But you opened the door." Aree tried to leave the house. She packed the urn, the cloth, the photo, the doll. But when she stepped outside, the world had changed. The sky was pale gray. The rice fields were flooded, though it hadn't rained. And the villagers were gone. Every house stood open, empty, like they had all vanished mid-step, except one house at the far end of the road, the home of Nong Tita's family, the pregnant woman who had died violently, whose spirit had never been sealed. Aree stepped inside. The air was thick with mold and perfume. A shrine stood at the center of the room, old, dusty, but still intact. Photographs lined the altar, all of Nong Tita, in life, in school, at her wedding, and one final photo of her body hanging from a tree. Aree covered her mouth. She turned away and froze, because standing in the open doorway was the woman in white, now fully visible, face pale and swollen. Her lips were stitched shut, just like the doll, but her eyes, black and endless, were fixed on Aree, not with hatred, but with grief so raw it curdled in the stomach. Then she opened her mouth, and the thread fell away, as if it had never been real. She whispered, "You opened me. Now open yourself. Let me in or take my place." The shrine burst into flame behind her. Photographs curled and blackened. The spirit stepped closer, one barefoot step, then another. Water pooled beneath her with each movement. Aree backed away, clutching the urn to her chest. Salt wouldn't stop her anymore. She wasn't just a spirit now. She was a debt unpaid. The fire didn't spread. It didn't burn the walls. Only the photographs. Only the memory. Only the proof. Aree ran back to the house. She slammed the door shut, but the floor was already wet. The candles had already gone out, and in the center of the room, the urn had opened again by itself. Inside was no longer ash, but teeth. Small, human, still bleeding. She knew what she had to do now. Find the fire, find the monk who ran, finish what was never burned, or the spirit would not ask again. She would take her place, and the urn would close once more. But this time, with Aree inside. It doesn't take fire to burn a village. Sometimes, it just takes one offering opened, and one spirit waiting. When the ritual is broken, the sky doesn't forget, and neither do the dead. The morning began like no other. The sun rose red, not warm, not gold, but red like coagulated blood behind a veil of smoke. And with it, the air changed. Heavier, still, thick with the scent of metal and jasmine that had soured. Aree stood at her grandmother's door and looked up. There were no shadows, not hers, not the houses, not even the trees. Everything stood lit, but flat, like the sun had chosen to show light, but not cast it. And above, birds circled in tight, frantic spirals. Then, one by one, they began to fall. Black birds, white eyes, thudding softly into the rice fields like rotten fruit from an unseen tree. Dozens, then hundreds, some still alive, some twitching, all silent. Aree backed into the house. The urn was still on the table, lid closed now, as if it had never opened. But the air around it buzzed. Literally, a low hum like thousands of wings fluttering at once. She picked it up. It was heavier again, and warm, like something inside had begun to stir. She didn't know why she went to the market that day. Maybe instinct, maybe guilt, maybe the need to see if the world outside her house was still real. But the village was no longer the one she remembered. The people were there, but they were different. Faces pale, eyes sunken, and none of them cast shadows. She walked past them, every head turned in unison. Children stopped playing, elders stopped chewing, vendors froze mid-transaction, and all of them stared. Not at her, at the urn, clutched to her chest like a newborn. A woman stepped forward, one Aree remembered from childhood, Auntie Lek, who sold sweet mangoes and always wore yellow. But now her face was blank, her lips cracked, and she said, in a voice too deep to belong to her, "You brought her back." The crowd repeated it, in unison. "You brought her back. You brought her back. You brought her back." Aree turned to run, but found herself encircled. Dozens of villagers, all unmoving, all chanting, their feet sinking into the dirt, leaving no prints, just as the spirit had. And then, the chanting stopped. Dead silence, until a single voice broke through. "Burn her properly, or take her place." Aree screamed and pushed through the crowd. No one stopped her. They parted for her like a curtain, not helping, not resisting,
only watching. She didn't look back. She ran all the way home, but even there things had changed. The shrine at the corner of the property had bloomed overnight. It had been rotting before, cracked and splintered, but now it stood vibrant, covered in fresh jasmine garlands, red string, lit candles that flickered though no one had lit them. And beside it, a bowl of blood, still warm, still steaming, with a baby's tooth floating inside. She fell to her knees. The wind shifted, carrying with it a sound, low, guttural, distant, chanting. 12 voices, all female, and rising. She turned to go back inside and saw a shadow, just one, standing in the doorway. Hers, but it wasn't attached to her. It stood ahead of her, not behind. And as she moved, it didn't. It smiled, and then turned and walked back into the house. Inside, the mirror had returned, whole again, mounted where it had once shattered. The reflection showed Aree standing outside, still on her knees, frozen. But inside the mirror, she was already in the house, already holding the urn, already chanting. And behind her, in the mirror's frame, the woman in white loomed closer. Aree turned away, refused to look again, but the chanting wouldn't stop. It echoed inside her head, even though her mouth was closed. She knew now the ritual wasn't just unfinished, it was unforgiven. She gathered her things: salt, jasmine, the monk's cloth, the photograph, and the urn. And with shaking hands, she opened a small leather notebook left by her grandmother, tucked inside a false floorboard under the altar. Inside was one line: "If they all forget, you must remember." On the next page, coordinates, not a temple, not a shrine, but a field, just outside the village, marked Final Fire. Aree left before the sun set. The sky was still red, but now it had deepened to crimson, like the last breath before bleeding out. As she passed the village border, no one stopped her, but in every window she saw them, watching, whispering, smiling, as if knowing she was walking not into salvation, but into her turn.
The sins that bind us are rarely our own. Some are handed down in silence, folded into prayers, hidden in urns. And the most dangerous ones are the ones done out of love. The coordinates led her to a clearing past the last paddy field, a stretch of scorched earth long abandoned, where grass refused to grow and the air was always colder than it should be. Locals never spoke of it, maps never marked it, but the crows remembered. They circled above as Aree arrived, black wings, silent eyes, watching, waiting. In the center of the field stood a stone ring, buried under vines and brittle weeds. 12 stones, smooth and waist-high, arranged in a perfect circle. And one spot in the center, still blackened by fire long extinguished. She stepped into the ring, her shoes crunching over broken jasmine petals, long dried to ash. Her hands trembled as she knelt. She placed the urn in the center, salt around it, jasmine beside it. She didn't light anything yet. She just sat there, listening. The field had no sound, no insects, no bird song, not even the wind. Only her own breath. And then, another. She turned and saw her. Not the spirit, not the drowned woman, but her grandmother, as she had been in life, wearing her red silk blouse, her silver hair in a tight bun, her face stern, but her eyes glassy with tears. She sat across from Aree, on the other side of the circle, as if she had always been there. She said nothing, just stared at the urn. And then, finally, softly, "I tried to protect you." The vision, or spirit, or memory, spoke with the same voice Aree had known since childhood, but now it carried weight, the weight of shame, the weight of truth. Her grandmother looked down at the ground. She wasn't supposed to die like that. We only wanted to keep her quiet, keep the village safe. "You killed her?" Aree asked, her throat raw. The grandmother shook her head. "No, but we let her die." She told Aree everything. How Nang Tida had been pregnant with a child out of wedlock, how whispers spread, how the elders demanded silence, demanded purity. So they took her to the temple under the guise of a blessing. They made her drink water laced with monk's ash, not poison, but something worse, a binding agent for souls. Then they banished her to the forest to be cleansed, but she never came back. They found her hanging 3 days later, her unborn child still inside her, unforgiven, unblessed, unburned. The village feared her return, so they performed the forbidden ritual, the twisted Wai Khwan, not to release her, but to trap her, use her spirit as a warning, as protection, a guard dog made of grief. Aree's grandmother was the one who led it. The urn was her design, the red thread her invention. But when the monk fled with the fire, everything unraveled. The jasmine never burned. The offering was never accepted. The spirit remained, caged, enraged, rotting in wait. I kept the urn hidden. I warned myself never to open it. I was supposed to burn it the night before I died, but I was too afraid, so I left it for you. Aree clenched her fists. You left me a curse. I left you a choice. Her grandmother's eyes shimmered. She won't accept fire from anyone now. Only blood, only sacrifice, and only from the one who broke the seal. Aree whispered, Then it has to be me. Her grandmother nodded. Or it will be everyone else. The vision faded. She was alone in the circle again. The urn trembled. Jasmine petals blackened. The wind returned, but it didn't blow. It hissed. Words carried on it. Finish it, or replace it. Aree struck the match. The first jasmine garland caught flame instantly, but the flame didn't spread. It died, snuffed out as if swallowed by the air. She tried again and again. Each time the flame flickered and failed. The urn remained cold, untouched. Then she heard a noise behind her, dragging feet. She didn't need to turn. She didn't need to. She knew who it was. The woman in white stepped into the ring, barefoot, soaked, her swollen belly glistening with fluid, her mouth torn open, her eyes locked on Aree. And then, softly, almost kindly, burn me properly or take my place. Aree looked down at her hands, at the matchbook, at the photograph, at the cloth, at the urn, and then at the blade. beside it. She hadn't brought it, but it was there, old, rusted, her grandmother's ritual knife. Sacrifice. Not fire, not salt, not jasmine. Blood. Aree stared at it, and at the spirit. She whispered, "What do you want from me?" The woman stepped closer. Tears streamed from her black eyes. An ending.
When jasmine cannot burn, it rots. When salt is scattered, it stains. And when the soul resists the ritual, it does not disappear. It waits. In the ash, in the breath, in your mouth. Aree didn't remember how she got home, only that by the time she opened the front gate, her lips were dry, her head was burning, and her tongue felt thick with grit. She stumbled into the kitchen and reached for water, but when she drank, she choked. The water was black, her mouth filled with ash, coarse, bitter, like she had been breathing smoke for days. She coughed until her throat burned, spat into the sink, and what came out was not just ash, but flower petals, jasmine, half burned, as if the spirit had begun to finish the ritual inside her. The mirror above the sink cracked again. Her reflection blinked late. Its mouth moved before hers did, and then it whispered, "She is already inside." Aree screamed and smashed the mirror, but the sound that echoed back wasn't glass shattering. It was a voice from inside the walls, a woman sobbing, not loud, just constant, like someone grieving in a room you could never find. She locked herself in the bedroom and drew another salt circle, but it was different now, weaker. The salt wouldn't stay in place. The line broke at the corners. The air inside the circle felt colder than outside. The boundary had stopped working. That night she dreamed of her grandmother again, but not alive, laid out on a slab, eyes open, mouth stuffed with jasmine, hands folded clutching the urn, and behind her the 13 women stood, silent, wet, each one now wearing Aree's face. She woke with blood in her mouth and something sharp between her teeth. She reached in and pulled out a baby's tooth. Not hers, not anyone's she knew, just one white, perfect tooth, still warm. She staggered to the bathroom. Her reflection had returned, but now it moved before her, not after. It smiled while she cried, and then raised a hand while hers stayed still. The reflection traced a word on the mirror with a finger dipped in ash. Ready. She collapsed on the floor, in the dark, the urn beside her now pulsing as if it had a heartbeat. Each pulse matched the pain in her temples. She tried to scream, but nothing came out. Only more ash, filling her throat, her lungs, her chest, like her body was being packed tight with the remains of someone else. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. The world outside her windows had turned dim, gray. The sky no longer moved. There was no sun, no moon, only haze. Time had stopped keeping count. Only one thing moved now: the urn. It had rolled slightly to the edge of the bed, and the lid was open again. Always. Inside was not ash anymore, but skin, a sliver of it, damp, soft, and just visible beneath it, an eye, open, watching. Aree crawled back, curled against the wall, and finally sobbed. "What do you want from me?" she begged. And the voice answered, from nowhere, from everywhere. "Not you, just your place. You broke the seal. You owe the seal. Finish the burning, or be the offering." That night the village was silent. Every spirit house turned inward. Every window flickered with unseen candlelight. Every mirror in every home cracked at the same time. 3:07 a.m. exactly. And Aree sat in her grandmother's prayer room, the floor wet with tears, hands black with ash, voice nearly gone, still whispering the chant, mirror backward, ash inside, salt around, jasmine must die. But nothing burned, nothing listened, because the fire wasn't hers to give anymore, only her body. She looked in the mirror one last time and saw the truth. There was no reflection, only the woman in white, smiling, reaching out, and mouthing one final sentence: "You taste like her." Some monks chant for healing, others for peace. But there are those who chant to keep something in. And when their voices stop, what they once sealed begins to wake. The hospital staff didn't ask questions when Aree returned. No forms, no ID, no words. Just wide eyes and silence. As if they had seen her before, in a dream they couldn't forget, or a nightmare that never really ended. Room 309 hadn't been cleaned. No one had entered it since a John Wera died. No one had dared. But his body was gone. No record of removal. No transfer. No cremation. Just missing. The bed was empty, but the mirror was still there. Untouched, still cracked, still hanging, still facing the door. Aree stepped inside, clutching the urn to her chest like a child would a doll, not for comfort, but to keep it from running away. Because now it moved when she wasn't looking, shifted, breathed, twitched like it had limbs and was only pretending to be still. On the floor beneath the mirror, she saw them. Footprints. Not bare, not wet, but black, as if something had walked across the floor on burnt feet. They led from the wall to the bed and stopped there. Aree sat, cross-legged on the floor, just like her grandmother had taught her during temple rites. She placed the urn in front of her, opened it. Inside, the cloth was gone. In its place, a human tongue, shriveled, branded with a symbol she didn't recognize, but it moved slightly like it was still trying to speak. She closed the lid, slowly, carefully, and then began to chant. Mirror backward, ash inside, salt around, jasmine must die. Again and again, until her throat turned raw, until her voice broke, until the mirror began to vibrate, the glass shimmered, and then it changed. No longer a reflection, now a window, and beyond it, not room 309, but the old temple, whole again, lit by lanterns, filled with the 13 women, chanting, weeping, holding hands in a circle around the center, where the monk once stood and failed. Aree reached forward, touched the mirror. It was cold, then hot, then suddenly soft. Her hand sunk through it, into the temple, into the vision. She didn't pull back. She crawled forward until she was no longer in the hospital, no longer in room 309, but standing in the center of the memory. The women looked at her, all of them, their faces blurred, their robes soaked, but their eyes the same, empty, accusing, forgiving, all at once. And at the front, where the monk once stood, was herself, holding the urn, mouth sewn shut, eyes red, jasmine burning at her feet, but giving off no scent, just heat. The ground beneath her cracked. From it came whispers, not words, names. The names of every woman who had been sacrificed, abandoned, bound. Nang Tida, Sawalak, Prani, Tida, Malai. And then, Aree. Aree staggered back, but the mirror behind her was gone. There was no way out now. Only forward, only inward, only into the fire. The chanting stopped. A single voice spoke from behind her. He never finished the offering, so now it finishes you. Aree turned. A Janwera stood there, barefoot, pale, mouth stitched shut, eyes black. He held out the same knife she had found at the fire circle, and in his free hand a garland of jasmine already burning. He knelt, placed the garland at her feet, then opened his mouth. The stitches split, and ash poured out, thick, black, with fragments of bone and hair. The floor turned wet, the lights died, and from the shadows, the women in white stepped forward. This time, she was smiling, not in malice, not in rage, but in relief. Aree fell to her knees. "Is this what you wanted?" she whispered. The spirit nodded. "Not your death, just your voice." And then she stepped forward, into Aree, through her. Her skin burned, her mouth filled again with ash. She gagged, screamed, and then silence. When Aree woke, she was back in room 309, the mirror gone, the floor clean, the urn in her lap, closed. But she no longer felt it pulling, no longer heard the chant, and when she looked at her reflection in the glass door, she smiled, before she meant to.
Some flowers are not meant to bloom. Jasmine is for purity, for peace. But when it is burned too late, it does not bless, it binds, and it reminds the living that what was offered was never accepted. The field was quieter now, too quiet, as if even the insects knew not to speak. Aree stood again in the stone circle, the urn in her hands, the salt in her pocket, the jasmine garlands wrapped tightly around her wrist, soft, fragrant, and already beginning to brown. She had returned to the place where the ritual was broken, but this time she was ready to finish it, or so she believed. She began at sunset, the color of the sky turning from gold to rust, then rust to blood.
She arranged the salt into a perfect ring, this time unbroken. She laid the urn in the center and placed the jasmine carefully around it, one petal at a time. Her hands no longer shook. Her breath no longer trembled. She had accepted that this might be her final act, and that in the end, not every story was meant to be escaped. Some were meant to be answered. She struck the match, held it to the jasmine. This time it caught. The flames danced slowly at first, hesitant, then rose, fierce and bright. The scent was overwhelming, not sweet, not sacred, but sharp, like something long dead suddenly remembered. The smoke curled into the air like a question no one wanted to hear, and from within it, she came. The woman in white, as always. But this time, she did not walk. She did not drag. She rose, straight up, through the smoke. Her robes floated around her like water. Her eyes burned, not with rage, but with knowing. And as Aree stood to face her, the spirit spoke without moving her lips. You returned it. You burned it. But do you even know what it was? Aree swallowed hard. An offering? The spirit shook her head slowly. A prison. A curse? No, a door. And suddenly, Aree understood. It had never been about trapping the spirit. It had been about giving her a vessel, an anchor, not to keep her away, but to keep her here. The ritual wasn't broken. It was incomplete by design, because if it had been finished properly, she would have left. She would have passed on. But they needed her, her pain, her rage, her power. The women in the village, the elders, even her grandmother, they had made her into a sentinel, an unwilling guardian spirit, a chained ghost, bound to jasmine and salt and chants she never agreed to. And the urn? It had never been meant to seal her away. It had been meant to keep her alive. Aree stepped back. Then why choose me? The woman in white floated closer, her voice inside Aree's skull. Because you opened the door, and you were never supposed to. What happens now? Now you choose. The fire blazed higher. The salt crackled. The air grew cold. The urn began to crack, a small fracture along the side, then another, and the whispers returned, 13 voices, chanting, but not the same chant, a different one, older, one Aree didn't recognize, and yet understood. She burns, you bloom, the jasmine wilts, the vessel chooses. And then the fire died, abrupt, silent. The smoke fell in on itself. The ashes cooled. The salt blew away. And in the center of the circle, the urn shattered, completely. No ash inside, no hair, no cloth, no tongue, no eye. Just one single jasmine petal, still white, untouched. Aree picked it up. It melted in her fingers, and suddenly she could breathe again. No ash, no petals in her mouth, no voice in her head, just silence. Real silence. She turned to leave. The spirit stood still, watching her, as the sky darkened and the crows returned to their trees. But Aree didn't look back. She crossed the ring, stepped beyond the stones, and for the first time in weeks, she felt light. Until she heard it, one word, soft, broken, almost regretful. Wait. She turned. The woman was gone, but in her place stood a girl, young, 16 maybe, pregnant, crying. Not with vengeance, but with sorrow.
She reached out a hand, and Aree hesitated, then took it, and in that moment, she knew the curse hadn't been on the spirit. It had been on the village, on the ones who had kept her here. And now, the jasmine had burned, the seal was broken, but not for her, for them. Aree awoke the next morning in her grandmother's bed. The urn was gone, the mirrors were gone, the spirit house outside had been rebuilt. Fresh flowers, fresh incense, fresh ash in the bowl. No one spoke of what had happened. No one needed to. The village had gone silent, but not empty. They were listening now, because something had changed, and something had been released.
When the last word is spoken, the ritual ends. But the echo, that lives on, in the soil, in the breath, in the ones who dared to speak. You cannot silence a spirit with fire, only with truth. Aree stayed in the house for 3 more nights. She did not chant. She did not dream. She no longer woke with ash in her mouth. The silence was strange, not empty, but clean. It felt like a room that had finally been aired after years of smoke. The villagers said nothing when they passed her gate. They offered no smiles, no questions, no incense. But now they bowed. Not in fear, in reverence, as if she had joined something older than family, older than custom, something that watched from behind the banyan trees. The urn was never found, not even shards. The field had swallowed it completely, and the circle of stones had sunk overnight into the earth, as if the land itself had closed the chapter. But one thing remained, the chant, and it still whispered through Aree's head at night, not in fear, but like a lullaby, as though the voices were no longer asking her to finish it, but thanking her for listening. She began to see them, just before sleep, faint figures at the edge of her vision. 13 women, still wet, still pale, but now calm, their eyes no longer pleading, just watching, like ancestors, like protectors. But then, on the 4th night, a new voice spoke, one that had not joined the chant before, a voice that came from deep within her bones, her own voice, but older, hollow, and it said, "Finish the final chant, or someone else will begin it." Aree lit a candle. She sat on the woven mat in the center of the house. She placed salt before her, not in a circle, just a line, not as defense, as recognition. She laid down jasmine petals, one for each woman, one for her grandmother, one for herself. And she spoke, softly, aloud, the chant that had haunted her for weeks. But this time, she added something new. Not just the old words, but the truth. We broke you. We bound you. We wore your grief like protection. But now, you are free, and we will carry the name. The wind outside shifted. The flame of the candle turned blue, and Aree knew the final chant wasn't for the spirit. It was for the village, for the bloodline, for the women who had been made into weapons, and for those who were never meant to become urns. The house creaked, the floor moaned, and from the rafters above, jasmine began to fall. Fresh, fragrant, untouched. Dozens of flowers rained softly down, covering the floor around her. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She whispered, "You can go now. The fire is finished. I am not your vessel. I am your voice." And then, silence. Real silence. The kind that doesn't hide anything behind it. The kind that means it's over. In the morning, the villagers gathered in the center of Ba Nong Luang. No one said it was a ceremony. No one brought drums or monks or prayer flags, but they all came. Aree stood at the front. She held no urn, no salt, no knife, only a single garland of jasmine. She laid it on the ground, stepped back, and for the first time, everyone chanted together. Not to bind, not to banish, but to bury what had been done, to offer peace not just to the spirit, but to themselves. The sky turned clear, a breeze returned to the village, and at the edge of the forest a single woman stood, in white, barefoot, smiling. She bowed once and disappeared into the trees. That night, Aree did not sleep. She didn't need to. She sat beneath the starlight, the final chant still echoing in her throat. Not a song, not a prayer, not even a warning, just truth and memory.
There are temples with no monks, shrines with no incense, but they are not forgotten. Because some places hold stories like wounds that never scab, and sometimes when you think it's over, the door creaks open again. Years passed. The village changed slowly. A new road was built. Phones worked most days. A cafe opened with plastic chairs and Wi-Fi that came and went like drifting spirits. But no one rebuilt the old temple. Wat Mai Bon Pi remained untouched, hidden. The trees thickened around it. Vines grew across its blackened beams. The Buddha statue was never found. Some said it walked away on its own. Others said it was swallowed by the earth. No one argued, because no one visited, except for tourists. Eventually, they came, drawn by local legends, TikTok rumors, articles on haunted Thailand. They brought drones and smartphones and cameras on sticks, but none of their footage ever worked. Static, corrupted files, batteries drained within minutes, and those who stayed too long, they brought back more than blurry photos. They brought back voices. The stories began again, small at first, children waking with wet footprints around their beds, phones chiming at 3:07 a.m. for no reason, jasmine blooming out of season, inside sealed jars. One girl posted a video, just a selfie outside the old gate. But when the footage was slowed down, frame by frame, behind her, someone stood. A woman in white, face hidden, belly round, watching. No one could explain it. No one tried to. The video was deleted. The girl stopped talking, but the legend grew. They say there's a shrine inside now, not to the Buddha, not to any god, but to a woman with no name. A small altar, hand-built from teak, covered in water-stained cloth and wilted jasmine.
Fresh offerings appear every few days. No one sees who leaves them, but they are always there. The locals still call it Wat Mai Bon Pi, the temple of the spirit village, and they still warn each other in low voices over dinner behind closed windows. Never stay overnight, never speak her name after dark, and never, ever open anything tied with red string. But they also tell another story about a girl who returned from Bangkok, who lit the fire, who finished the chant, who walked through the ritual not to bind a spirit, but to listen to her. Her name is not spoken often, but when it is, it's with respect. Children leave flowers on her grandmother's steps. A photograph of her sits in the village's new school, tucked in a quiet hallway near the prayer room. It shows Aree in her 20s, holding a single garland of jasmine. She is smiling, but her eyes look older than her face. They say she left the village again sometime after the final offering. No one saw where she went, but on some mornings, the spirit house outside her grandmother's home is swept clean. New incense, new petals, footprints in the dew. Barefoot, soft, still wet. And every year on the longest night, someone lights 13 candles on the temple altar. No one claims it, but no one puts them out, because the village knows the ritual is finished, but the story is not. One morning, a traveler arrived, foreign, young, curious. He came with a backpack and a wide grin, asking questions in broken Thai. He was told not to visit the temple. Of course, he went anyway. He returned at dusk, quiet, changed. He carried something in his hands, a sealed bronze urn, wrapped in banana leaves, bound with red string. He asked where to burn it. No one answered. They only stared. And an old woman, Wai Khwan, still alive, older than time, stepped forward and placed a hand on his chest. She whispered, "Not again." He left that night. No one saw him after. But in the days that followed, the jasmine at the shrine wilted. The footprints returned. The mirrors in town began to fog, even without steam. And the air around Wat Mai Bon Pi turned colder once more. So now the story is told with an ending and a warning. Do not open. Burn only at the old temple. Do not forget the jasmine. And if you smell something sweet in the dark, something soft and floral, don't breathe it in. Don't follow it. Just close your eyes and wait for dawn.